Thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me here today. I'd like to welcome all Ananda and the 15 or 20 other people who have joined us online, and you who are here in Maitriya Hall. I'm happy to say that this is not the first time I have spoken here. In fact, the first time I ever gave a public speech was in this hall in 1976. And some time ago, I was reading a study of fear and anxiety. And they had done a survey and asked people to say what they thought was the most fearful, unpleasant, and anxious experiences they ever had. And top of the list was a death in the family. And second was giving a public speech. I must say that surprised me, but apparently many people, the idea of being unexpectedly asked to give a talk in front of a large audience is a cause of great anxiety and fear. So I had arrived in Sri Lanka. I'd been in India for 3 years. I arrived in Sri Lanka and turned up in Maradana. And I was staying in Odi Pansala or Sri Lanka Vidyalaya at that time. And after about a week, a man came around and asked to see me and invited me to give a talk. I had no idea where Maitriya Hall was or what Maitriya Hall was, but with some uncertainty, I offered. At the appointed time, a car came and picked me up and brought me here. And I was met by a gentleman, Mr. Alec Robinson. And he was a very nice gentleman. I gave a talk to the best of my ability. And Mr. Robinson was so nice. Then he spent the next 20 minutes correcting all the mistakes that I'd made. Those of you who remember Mr. Robinson will know that was one of his habits. You would give a talk and then he would just clarify what you had said. I think in all the years that he was a Buddhist, he never lost his enthusiasm for the Dhamma. And for that, you have to admire and appreciate him. And certainly, you might say he was my mentor for public speaking. A lot has happened since that time. After 20 years here, I moved to Singapore. I started giving talks in a Buddhist center there, run by Venerable Belanvilla Dhammaratana. By that time, I'd given quite a few talks, and I'd taken on board all the corrections that Alec Robinson had given me. And by that time, I think I could give a fairly good talk. So I started giving talks in Singapore under the auspices of Venerable Belanvilla Dhammaratana. And after a while, so many people started coming that they suggested that we start another society, and that happened. That became the Dhammamandala Society, which still functions today. And for the next 20 years, I was the spiritual advisor of that place. And then in 2017, when I felt that I had given enough of my knowledge of the Dhamma to other people, that it was about time that I started to spend a bit of time on myself. I think one of the problems some teachers of Dhamma have is they learn the Dhamma, they become good at explaining it to others, they're asked all the time to explain it to others, and they become so busy explaining the Dhamma to others that they don't spend enough time actually practicing it. Somebody online just laughed. Who was that? Okay. So I decided basically to retire, or at least retire from public speaking. I returned to Australia for certain reasons. Because I'd been out of Australia for over 40 years, it took quite a while to prove who I was. That took several months. And then for various reasons, mainly for family reasons, I ended up moving to and living on a small island about 20 miles off the coast of Australia. And that's where I live today, in a small house or small kuti. I have my very large library with me. And other than the postman, nobody comes. But before I continue, I just want to tell you a story of something that happened to me before I was a monk. I had come from Australia to Thailand to become a monk. For various reasons, I didn't like Thailand. So I went to Burma. In those days, a foreigner could only stay in Burma for 7 days. So while I was there, I met a meditation teacher. He was a disciple of Mahasi Sayadaw. So he talked to me about meditation, and he advised me to go back to Bangkok, get a second visa for Burma, come again, and I could join a meditation course. So that's what I did. Got a visa for Burma, arrived back, straight away went into a 7-day meditation course. That was the first time I had any guided experience on meditation. So I did this 2 more times. And the third time, I was informed that I would not be given another visa to Burma. That was the last one. So I returned to Burma, and I decided to spend that week seeing a little bit of the country. And so I took an aeroplane to Mandalay. And from Mandalay, I went to Bagan. Now, you might say Bagan is the Anuradhapura of Burma. It's a huge ancient city. In fact, it is much, much bigger than Anuradhapura. It's huge. It was the capital of Burma for several centuries. So I went there. I was quite fascinated by the place. And there's one place there called, I think it's called Shwegugi Pagoda. Now, there are literally hundreds of pagodas and temples and stupas in and around Bagan. And most of them are ruined. But this great stupa is, people still use it. It's a beautiful place. It's covered with gold leaf. Beautiful. Anyway, I was walking around this pagoda, this stupa, and the heat was tremendous. And the paving stones around the stupa were of white marble. And so the heat coming down from above and the glare of the sun coming up from the marble paving, it was really not very pleasant. So I saw a small pavilion in which there were 10 or 15 people, and they were listening to a man, or they were watching a man read another man's palm. He was telling their fortune by looking at their palm. So I stopped and I watched this. I was out of the sun with some shade, and I watched this. Now, I have absolutely no interest in or confidence in the occultic arts. I do not believe in astrology. I do not believe in palm reading. I have never accepted those things. In the case of palm reading, if both your hands get chopped off, what happens to your future? I don't know. Anyway, when this old man had finished reading another man's palm, he looked at me and he suggested that he read my palm. You know what it's like. They always think the foreigners are more interesting. So I declined. He insisted, so I said, okay. And I can't remember anything he said. Probably he said the same old stuff. You're going to be rich, you're going to meet a lovely woman, you're going to get married, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember. But I do remember one thing that he said. Who is that? Who is that? I don't know who it is. Somebody's talking. Doesn't matter, I suppose. But you carry on, Bhante. That's. You carry on. You carry on, Bhante. Okay. But then he said something, and another man who knew English translated it for me. The fortune teller said, you will become a monk. Now, I'd gone to Thailand and Burma in order to become a monk. So I thought that was a pretty good guess. But then I thought, all Burmese males become a monk once in their life. That was a very safe guess. Then he said something else, and I couldn't understand what it was. And a man translated it, and he said, you will live on an island. That was meaningless to me. But then he corrected himself. He said, no, 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 you will live on 2 islands. And that's the end of the story. And then about 10 years ago, I started writing an account of my life. And I remembered that story. That's the first time I have thought of that incident for 35 years. And I realized, my goodness, I've spent my whole life as a monk on Sri Lanka, which is an island, and then on Singapore, which is an island. And I'll have to admit, when I remembered that, I was pretty amazed. That guy told my fortune. Then something happened. I told this story to my brother, and I thought that he would be impressed. And he said, nonsense. That guy didn't know what he was talking about, because you're living on an island now. You're living on 3 islands. And so, to return to the story, I now live on this small island. The only person who comes is the post office man, the postman. So I do three things. I spend a lot of time meditating, more time than I ever have before. I have a very extensive library, which I consult, read, and it gives me a great deal of joy. I like reading. And I look after a small garden. And in the since 2017, because I don't do funerals, I don't give sermons, I don't do pinkamas, I don't go for pindapata, I have a lot of free time. The garden doesn't take a lot of time. Once a week, you tidy it up and cut the grass, and it's okay. And so I've started writing. And I've started writing more than I ever have before, because instead of now talking about what I know, I have the time and the skill to write about what I know. And just a few days ago, on the 6th of October, I had my 74th birthday. So later on, if you wish to give me a birthday present, you can do that. I don't mind birthday presents, even if they're a few days late. And so I've started writing articles. So for the last 7 or 8 years, I've written about 40 articles, mainly for the Sunday Times, but primarily for the Sunday Island. And some of those articles, I've expanded them into books. And so finally, I decided to write about everything I know about the Buddha. And people have said to me, why don't you write something about the Dhamma or something about meditation? And what I always say is, I can't think of anything new to say about that. I think in the last 15 or 20 or maybe 30 years, some very, very good books on explaining the Dhamma, some very good books on meditation have become easily available. So other people are doing that job. Here in Sri Lanka, you've got people like Venerable Dhammajiva. You have people like Kiribati Nyanananda. He writes a lot. And others as well. And in the last few days, I've gone to several bookshops. I've just come from Gunasena's bookshop, just nearby. And at the Colombo Book Fair, I was just astonished at how many publishers there were how many books were available, and how many people came to have a look at the books. I must say I was very, very impressed. The range of subjects, the fact that people have the habit of reading books. So I was very, very impressed. And my reason for going to the book fair, coming to Sri Lanka in order to go to the book fair, was to promote my most recent book, which is this. It's called Footprints in the Dust, The Life of the Buddha from the Earliest Sources. Should you be interested, it also on the 3rd, it came out in Sinhala. And I'm very happy to say that it's already in German, in Indonesian, in Chinese, and apparently somebody is now translating it into Spanish, and somebody in the United States is translating it into Vietnamese. And just 2 days ago, I got news that it has just been published in Marathi. Marathi is the language of the Indian state of Maharashtra. And I'd have to tell you, I'm delighted that a lot of people have found the book to be interesting. As I was writing it, I suspected that the book might attract some attention. Now, it's easy to write a book and attract attention. You just say something outrageous, then the religious authorities will condemn the book, and then everybody will go out and buy it. But I'm happy to say that in this case, the book has not attracted critical attention. It has attracted admiration. And I think that there is one particular reason for this, is because I have read very deeply and thought very deeply about who the Buddha was and how do we know about him. Now, the Buddha did live a long time ago, and he lived in a world, at least in India, where writing had not been developed yet. So if you have no written records from a particular time, obviously that's a big problem as far as history is concerned. But the problem is more than that. The problem is material evidence about the Buddha is lacking. So, for example, material evidence about Jesus, there is a lot of evidence, indirect evidence about Jesus. So, for example, the Roman governor Pontius Pilate condemned Jesus to death, according to the Bible. Well, they have found inscriptions mentioning his name. And there is other indirect evidence. In the case of the Buddha, there is no direct evidence at all. And the reason for that is primarily the climate. So a rock or a stone or a sculpture in stone may survive, but a palm leaf manuscript or something carved on wood, that simply would not survive in the Indian climate. So as far as material evidence is concerned, as far as written evidence is concerned, we really don't have a lot of information about the Buddha. However, we do have something, and that is we have the Tipitaka. Now, this set of documents was never, for at least several hundred years, was not written down. It was transmitted by memory. And when people hear this, they think it couldn't possibly be very accurate. But they don't understand what Indian society was like at the time of the Buddha. The Brahmin class had evolved an extremely sophisticated way of training the memory to remember large amounts of information. Now, people think that writing information down is more accurate than remembering things, but that's not the case. And in a society like India at that time, when people were not bombarded by all the sensory input that we get all of the time, on the television, on radio, on signs all over the city, you've got great big billboards advertising things. You've got newspapers, you've got radio, you've got television. In those days, they were simply not bombarded with all that information. And in the case of Brahmins, they had nothing to do except sit when they were small children, boys, from about the age of 8, they were trained to recite and remember the Vedic hymns. That is the sacred literature of Brahmanism or Hinduism. Now, if you then look at how many Brahmins or people from the Brahmin caste became Buddhist monks, well, more than 50% of the Buddha's monastic disciples were from the Brahmin caste. They had spent their childhood training their memories, and it was they who committed the Buddha's sayings to their memory and to pass them on for several hundred years before they were written down. Now, I have read many times, the first time that the Tipitaka was written down was in Aluvihara in 100 BC. That's not true. Anytime I hear somebody say that, it's usually a Sinhalese person, I hit them over the head. It isn't true. This is what's true. The first time the Tipitaka was written down in Sri Lanka was in Aluvihara. But it was most certainly, it's almost certain that it was written down in India before then. However, both in Sri Lanka and in India, we know that even when writing became commonly used, even then, some sects of Buddhism or some monasteries still did not write the Tipitaka down, even though they had writing, even though they had palm leaf. Why? Because they thought that memory was more accurate. So you'll probably know, even in the Anuradhapura period in Sri Lanka, there were still groups of monks who wouldn't write the Tipitaka down. They were called Barnakas. So, as in India, some monasteries would specialize in remembering the Digha Nikaya or the Anguttara Nikaya or the Jatakas or something like that. They specialized in that. And what would happen is a monk would spend a few years with Barnakers who remembered the Digha Nikaya. When he got all that in his memory, then he'd move for 4 or 5 years to another monastery where they specialized in the Anguttara Nikaya. And he would learn that. And after 10 or 15 years, he would know quite a lot. So there is no good reason to believe that the information in the Pali Tripitaka is inaccurate. There's no good reason to believe that. And I don't believe it. So here we do have a verbal record of the Buddha. That's the first thing. The second thing I took into account is actually that there are 2 Buddhas. Now in Sri Lanka you believe in, 25 Buddhas, isn't it? How many Buddhas have there been? Past Buddhas? What? You do a puja where you pay homage to all the different past Buddhas, yeah? How many are there? 28, thank you. Well, I don't know if there were 28, but I do think that there were at least 2. And who are these 2 Buddhas? Well, the first Buddha is the one who is described and who is mentioned in the Tripitaka. And the second Buddha is the Buddha of tradition. And they're quite different. So, for example, everybody knows that the Buddha spent 1 vasa up in the Tawatingsa heaven, teaching his mother the Abhidhamma. Now, there was a time when I was not a great fan of the Abhidhamma. In fact, I didn't like it at all. My opinion has changed, but at that time I didn't like it at all. And my idea about the Abhidhamma was, if ever I had difficulty sleeping, I would either turn on the cricket and I would fall asleep in 5 minutes. And if Sri Lanka was not playing Australia or India, I'd pick up a book on the Abhidhamma, I'd start reading it, and I'd fall asleep in 3 or 4 minutes. That was my idea about the Abhidhamma. However, so the idea is, the Buddha spent 3 months teaching his mother the Abhidhamma. Then, according to the legend, he came down back to earth on what sounds like an enormous escalator. Now, I'll have to tell you that I have my doubts about that. But whether I doubt it or not, this is an important thing. That story is not found in the Tripitaka. It's not in the Digha Nikaya, it's not in the Anguttara Nikaya or the Samyutta Nikaya, it's not in the Vinaya. Now, this story is about the Abhidhamma. So the logical place you would expect to find that story would be in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Now, nearly all the suttas that we have start by telling you where the Buddha was when he taught that sermon. Ewang me sutang ekang bhagava savatiyang viharati jetavane, or wherever. So you would expect in the Abhidhamma to start with the words, thus have I heard. At one time the Buddha was in the Tawatings of heaven with his mother, and he taught the Abhidhamma. You would expect that. There was nothing in the Abhidhamma about that, nothing at all. So is that story true? I'm not in a position to say. But what I decided to do was to try to identify the Buddha as he is described in the Tripitaka, and don't worry about the Buddha as he is described in later tradition. And this is not to say that those later traditions are not valid or are not true. I gave myself the task of trying to describe for the reader, how did the people who compiled the Tripitaka, how did they think about the Buddha? What did they remember about him? What does the Tripitaka say about that Buddha? And the result of that was this book. So I spent 5 years reading through the Tripitaka to find out every little piece of information it says about this man, the Buddha. What he did, what he ate, how he dressed, how he sat, how he conducted himself in a debate, how he acted when he went to somebody's home for a dana. And I discovered that there's actually a huge amount of evidence, there's a huge amount of information about this aspect of the Buddha. I will give you 3 examples of some of the information that I found. The first one is there are quite a few places in the Tripitaka where it says the Buddha went to a hall or somebody's home or some building, and before he entered, he leaned down and washed his feet. Now, why did he do that? Because in those days, everybody did that. Near the door of every hall or every house would have been a pot of water, and anybody who entered it, before they entered, they would just take some of that water and wash their feet. And that's what the Buddha did. The Buddha did something that ordinary people did. Now, I suspect that some people, at least, might be shocked to hear that the Buddha washed his feet. Buddhas don't wash their feet. The devas come down and wash their feet. Well, that may be true, but there's no information about that in the Tripitaka. The Buddha says he simply washed his feet. Here's another one. This is one of my favorites. One day the Buddha is giving a Dhammadesana. And halfway through the Dhammadesana, he sneezed. Buddhas don't sneeze. Well, according to the Tripitaka, they do. So he was giving a talk, he sneezed, and everybody in the audience shouted out, "Long live." If while I was talking, I sneezed, what would you say to me in Sinhala? How do people react when somebody sneezes? What do you say? Oh, come on, you must say something. Don't you say, bless you, or... So what's the singular word for them? Huh? Buddha Rajan Wahanse, something, I don't know. Apparently Sinhalese don't do that. Well, in most cultures, they do that. They say something. So here the Buddha sneezes, everybody shouts out, live long, or long live. And then the Buddha addressed his audience. He said, when somebody sneezes and you say long live, do they live long because of that? That's a good question. And people in the audience, at least some people in the audience, said no. And the Buddha said, then don't do that. I like that story. So according to the Tipitaka, the Buddha used to sneeze sometimes. But there's something even more unusual. There's a place in the Tipitaka where the Buddha says this, and I am not exaggerating, and if you don't believe me, look in the book. I give the reference and the page number from the Tipitaka where you can find it. This is what the Buddha says. When I am on a journey, and we know that the Buddha spent a lot of his time walking from one place to another. And we know that roads weren't very good at that time, a little bit like Colombo roads. So if you want to, probably many of them were more like tracks. So the Buddha said, when I'm on a journey and I'm walking from one place to another, when I have to go to the toilet, he said, I look up the road and I look down the road, and if there's nobody coming, then I squat down and go to the toilet. Now, I have been reading the Tipitaka for decades, and I had never seen that before. The Buddha squatting down and going to the toilet? That's what it says. That's what he says. So, to me, that is so unusual. It's so different from how we think about the Buddha. I had to go to the Pali to check it, and I did. And then I also sent it to a friend of mine, an English monk who's very, very good at Pali, and he confirmed that's exactly what it says. So it's in the book. Yes, the Buddha used to go to the toilet. Ah, that's getting a bit hard. So here we have three examples of the Buddha, as it were, behaving just like an ordinary person. But then you find other things too. You find, for example, there's another place where somebody attended one of the Buddha's talks, and he said, when the Buddha has finished speaking, people get up and leave. But as they leave, they keep their eyes on him. In other words, as they leave, they keep on looking at him. In other words, they have been so moved, so impressed, no doubt not just what the Buddha said, but his countenance, how he behaved, the aura of peace and tranquility around them. We have also descriptions of the Buddha smiling. There's no description of the Buddha laughing, and there's no description of the Buddha saying anything that made other people laugh. But there is many references to him smiling, and so on. So what I did was, I went through the Tipitaka and I identified every single reference that tells us something about what the Buddha did, how he behaved, how he looked, how he reacted to other people, etc., and put it in the book. So this is not about the Dhamma. There are already many good books on that subject. It's not about Abhidhamma or Vinaya. There are many good books on the subject. And there are many well-written books on the second Buddha, the Buddha of legend and history. The Buddha, not as he is described in the Tripitaka, but as he is described in the tradition. Once I went to Miyamori out of Kandy. Has anybody heard of Miyamori? What is special about Miyamori? What's that? I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised.
Mimure Dhammavansa. Mimure Dhammavansa Tero.
Somebody's talking on the computer, but I can't understand.
Yeah. There
please tell me,
was a monk.
what do you know about Miyamori?
There was a monk.
Please,
who died
please.
3 years
First,
ago.
second, third lady. Not developed. No, it's not developed at all. Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying, but you do know about it. I can't hear. It doesn't matter. Thank you. Right, you can.
It's a village far away from Kandy.
It is.
It's not a developed place, and very primitive people live there.
Well, I don't know about that, but anyway.
Yes, and very few families are there.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Yeah. They're very primitive people. I didn't find them very primitive people, but at that time, I don't know now, it's the only village in Sri Lanka which is not linked to any road. The only way to get there is to walk over the knuckles, quite high mountains, and then you walk down. There may be a road there now. Anyway, I used to know one of the senior policemen in Kandy. Very nice guy. And one day he said to me, Hamburu, I'm going to go to Miyamori. Would you like to come with me? And I said, what's so great about that place? And he told me. And I thought, that's interesting. So I said, yeah, I'll come with you. So myself, him, and 4 other policemen, we tramped all the way up the mountain, and then you have to go all the way down. And on the way there, I asked him, why have you come to this place? Why are we going to this place? And he said, well, I have to go there at least once a year to arrest anybody who's done anything wrong. And he told me he can always identify those people because when the villagers see him coming down, all the bad guys start running away into the hills. So before he gets there. So that's how he can identify them. Anyway, We spent the night there. People were very, very hospitable. They've never seen a Suruhanduru before. And I spent the night in the house of a very poor family. And at one point I was talking to the grandmother. And the grandmother said to me, Mehandru, do you know the Buddha was 18 feet tall? I said, really? He said, yeah. Yes, Mom. I said, when he went to somebody's house for dana, how did he get through the door? And she said, oh, don't know. I said, when he went for Pindapata, how did somebody put something in his bowl? And she said to me, maybe they have a ladder. And the other thing she said to me, which made me laugh, was she said, Hamdara, do you know when the devas drop a stone from heaven, it takes 3 months before it hits the ground? So here we have a simple, devout lady. And this is what she's been told about the Dhamma, about the Buddha, and other things too. But my job here was not to record these legends and stories. And incidentally, some of these legends and stories are really quite beautiful. But my job was just to look or to do something that apparently nobody has done before, which is just identify how the Arahats at the first council, what did they remember about, and what did they think was useful to record about the Buddha. And that's what's in this book. Now, I wanted people to also have the confidence to know that I'm not giving my opinion. So everything I say, there is a reference to the Tipitaka, either the Dhammapada or the Sutta Nipata or the Udana or any of these books, so you can check it yourself. This is not what I am recording. This is what the Arahats at the first council, what they thought was important to record. So I'm happy that towards the end of my life, I hope I've still got a few years to go, that I've been able to make a contribution to Buddhism that apparently nobody else has done so far. And I am very happy that other people seem to feel that the information in the book is worth reading and worth knowing, because so far the book has been translated, I think, 5 times so far. And hopefully it will be translated into other languages too. Anyway, 6 months ago, I got a call from a Sri Lankan Hamduru living in the United States. And he told me that he had got a copy of this book and it fascinated him and amazed him. And he asked me for permission to translate the book into Sinhala, which I readily gave. And so over the next few months, we had, WhatsApp meetings nearly every day. Sometimes we argued over some Pali words. His Pali is much better than mine. Sometimes he wasn't quite sure why I used a particular word, or whether what I said was what he understood. And so it gave me great confidence that he is taking that job seriously, that he is not putting his own opinions. He wants to know and translate as accurately as he can what I have written. And I have confidence that that's what he has done. But since the book came out in Sinhala, people have told me that he's a very good writer in Sinhala, that his Sinhala is very pleasant to read, that it is lyrical and readable, which makes me even more happy. So this is the reason why I came to Sri Lanka, to attend the Colombo Book Fair and promote this book. If you have the time and the interest, I hope you'll get a copy. It's easily available, and some parts of it might open your eyes. Now, as a writer, I have discovered one of the downsides of being a writer. One of the frustrations of being a writer. So I will tell you this secret. What happens is you write a book, you spend months preparing it, you think you've done a good job, you send it to the printer, they print it, it becomes available to the public, you get a copy, you read it, and the first page you open, you see a mistake. I tell you. Now, that didn't happen to me. Something worse. As soon as I opened the book, I remembered something else I could have put in there but forgot. And what was the thing I forgot? I wanted to put everything that the Tipitaka says about the Buddha, what he looked like, what he ate, how he chewed his food. It's all in there. And as soon as I opened the book, some of the words jogged my memory, and I realized that there was something that I should have put in that book but forgot. And that is this. We know what the Buddha looked like. We know what he said. We know who he said it to. But we also know something else. We know how he said it. And by that I mean, how did he talk? What did it sound like? Now, people have different voices. Sometimes it's gruff and rough. Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes it's unclear. Sometimes it's very pleasing. They have a very pleasing voice. Believe it or not, there are two quite detailed descriptions of what the Buddha sounded like. And I forgot to put it in the book. I was not pleased. However, there is a new edition of the book coming out in the United States, and it will have that in it. And as a result of that frustrating experience, I quickly wrote another book, which was also released at the book fair. And these are 26 articles about other aspects of the Buddha, which I did not put in this book because I thought that they weren't important enough. But also the third, I think it's the third article in the book. The fourth article in the book is how the Buddha spoke. So if you get that book, get this one too. And with that, I'll finish my talk. I hope you found that interesting. And if there's anything you'd like to ask, I will do my best to answer any questions that you might have.